federal government yesterday committed itself again to the emergence of Nigeria's nominee, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, as the Director General of the World Trade Organization. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs said Nigeria will continue to engage stakeholders to ensure that Okonjo-Iweala emerges successor to Ambassador Roberto Azevedo, who steps down on August 31st, a year ahead of the completion of his second-year term in office. But for the opposition of the United States, Okonjo-Iweala will have been announced on Wednesday as the first female and African to lead a global trade body. In the race for the post, she had garnered 163 of the 164 members of the trade organization to be named the preferred candidate for the job compared to a challenger, Yoo Min-hee of South Korea, who's been backed by the U.S. This is great coming from the government.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
President Buhari has been on board from day one and has given Mrs. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala his personal assurance that he will do his utmost to see her through to the end. So this is encouraging. In this case, I'm convinced that delay is not denial. The WTO does have its rules, and where consensus is not possible, they will go to a vote, and it will be a case of simple majority where consensus is not possible. So the United States cannot play the spoiler here because unlike the UN, where they have, they're a permanent member of the Security Council, they have veto power, that does not apply in the WTO, thank goodness. It's one country, one vote. It's not weighted in any way in the favor of the United States. So I'm hopeful.
When you talked about veto, Dr. Vowa, I come to you. The last one came to my mind. One veto vote is equal to 99 or more.
Anyway, I think first let us commend the Nigerian government. Yesterday we were saying that we should not be complacent. We should not take anything for granted because it is not over, as they say, until it is over. And the point was made clear that the United States does not exercise any veto power in this regard. But despite that, Nigeria has a duty, and President Buhari personally has a responsibility to continue to provide the leadership required in this regard. He being the #1 foreign policy man of the country, the chief foreign policy officer of the country. And in this regard, as he has demonstrated with the election of Akinwumi Adesina, doctor, as for a second term at the African Development Bank, he has again shown that commitment with regard to Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala's candidature for the Director Generalship of the WTO. And he made a point when Dr. Okonjo-Iweala visited him. He said, well, these people, they didn't work for my party, but they are Nigerians, and they are distinguished Nigerians, and I have an obligation to defend, any Nigerian who is deserving. And I think that was a great moment of statesmanship on his part, and to see that he has remained consistent in that direction is commendable. Second, I would again also like to praise Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who, in spite of what many seem to have interpreted as a setback, still went on Twitter and said, look, we're not discouraged. We're forging ahead. It's only one part of the process that has been completed. There is still a process ahead. And I guess that's a message to all our supporters, all the volunteers at home and abroad, and all the 163 countries that supported her. Now, the United States. First point about the United States. The United States is arguing about procedure, the process, bringing her at the end of the race, bringing her up. Now, why is it that the United States had to wait till the last minute to complain about procedure?
That's what they always do.
The relevant document is the procedure for the appointment of the WTO Director General of December 2002. And if you look at that document, nominations paragraphs 11 to 12, there was no way in which Nigeria breached that process. In the consultations process in paragraph 15, which the Troika, David Walker from New Zealand and 2 other ambassadors, they interviewed the candidates, they got their CVs, they did everything, they followed the due process. The last stage under that document is paragraph 15, which is a consultation process, and they went through all of that. Now, the U.S. has not come out to say this is what we are against. So that is why the analysis we did yesterday, in my view, remains valid. This is a case of America standing up against multilateralism and resorting to isolationism and unilateralism. Now, the second question I raised is about President Trump himself. Can we legitimately, I know it's a very sensitive subject, accuse President Trump personally of not liking Africans?
Yes.
In other words, you can use the wrong word. Is it some kind of racist bias against Africans? He was against Tedros Ghebreyesus of the WHO and getting the U.S. to move against the WHO. And look at how it was so difficult for Dr. Ghebreyesus to get that job. He got it because Africans stood together. Now, the African Development Bank, second term for Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, it was also the United States that raised an objection. At the end of the day, reason prevailed. Now it is the WTO with Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And don't forget that there is a ring of deja vu to this. I think it was in 2012 that Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala made a bid also for the leadership of the World Bank. It was again the Americans, that frustrated that process and gave it to a Korean, an Asian. Now this time around, we're faced with the same situation. So I don't know, but I just thought I should throw this up. But however, paragraph 20 says voting is a last resort. And as Tundun pointed out, every country has just one vote. So no country can veto. The worst that will happen on November 9 is that those 163 countries, and that's why diplomacy by Nigerian and African leaders and the African Union is important as we move towards November 9. Now, one country, one vote. If the U.S. likes, they can vote against. 163 countries, if we hold on to their vote, then the thing is in the bag. And we can move ahead and begin to sow our ISHOG, and the trip to Geneva will begin.
But I want to just say something about what you said. It's not about Trump. We all know Trump's racist dog whistles, but it's an American thing, which you said about 2012. Look at Kofi Annan, who I mentioned yesterday as well. Then the president was George Bush. He was undermined, frustrated, thwarted at every turn by the U.S. They seem to have some kind of problem with Africans heading supranational institutions, and I really cannot understand why. And those arguments that they threw up, relatedly, as you said, remember Egypt expressed their opposition to Dr. Okonjo-Iweala's nomination by Nigeria. All of this has been addressed months ago, so why now?
I mean, let me quote Professor Kiteruwa, you cannot be more correct.
But we hope that South Korea, having not shown any very strong objection, would perhaps before November 9 be persuaded perhaps to withdraw the candidacy of Miss Yu.
Dr.
Because it's within their rights.
It's so obvious.
And I hope they do that. And great point you raised about 2012 and Americans ensuring that the South Korean person got there. And you saw how the man's tenure ended. There was anarchy amongst members of staff in the World Bank. He didn't run the World Bank properly. There was disgruntled staff.
South Korea is their vassal state.
It's funny. It's painful. It's painful. That's all on Headline News. We'll take a short break. Now, when we return, we have the trio of Rotus, Michael, and Adesua to give us updates. COVID-19 business, world business. Welcome back to the morning show right here on the Rise News channel. It's Mr. Dependable himself. He's Rotus Odiri. Great to have you, Rotus.
Hi, good morning, Doctor. Good morning, Tundu.
Good morning.
So we're talking about Desmond Elliot here, but this is really more about a Twitter feature that was introduced to us, I think it was late August or last month. So Twitter has allowed for you to control the amount of replies on social media. So if you look at this, remember Desmond Elliot was on a rise, he was on our network, I think it was just yesterday or so, and he was talking about what occurred with respect to his, him calling adults children, and his it seemed like his narrative was, he was leaning towards a social media builder or control social media. But anyway, he says, I've read your honest feedback and suggestions, and I sincerely apologize for addressing the youth as children. I did not mean to be insensitive with this. At the bottom, if we take a look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that I circled something in red there, because I actually tried to reply to him and say, oh, well done, you've apologized. But you can see who can reply. It says people Desmond Elliot mentioned can reply. If you look at his second set of tweets where he just talks about how people were crying in his constituencies, I've circled the reply feature. So if you try and click on that, it's grayed out. You cannot reply. He can choose who replies to these tweets. So in the context of a business, let's imagine this was Desmond Elliot Incorporated, and there was some scandal or he made some offhand comments that led to backlash, and he's the CEO. He comes out now and says, I'm really sorry for what happened, but he can choose who responds to the threat. This conversation we're having right now, if Tundu or Rufai originates a conversation on social media and only tags Dr. Abati, Rufai, myself, then only the three of us can reply to whatever Tundu is saying. If a business, from a public relations perspective, what is the impact on controlling replies on social media? So essentially, the narrative is, when Twitter introduced this, and we're now seeing this in actual practice, they're saying that, well, is this trending towards censorship? Or if a business wants to come out with a new program, or somebody writes a book, or you want to promote something, you can control who replies and talks up or promotes your product or service. If a brand or a company has a customer relations issue and they come out on social media and want to address the public, they can choose who responds to it. So seeing this in practice, I mean, on the one hand, some say that social media is getting out of hand. There are trolls, there are disrespectful people. We should be able to control who can respond to interactions on social media. On the other hand, people are saying, well, it's trending towards censorship because you are controlling free speech and for folks to be able to respond to you. So that's pretty much what I noticed from his response, and also seeing on Twitter. I've never tried the option myself, but I think going forward, it's going to be interesting to see how narratives are shaped and controlled on social media by being able to control and dictate who it is that can respond to you. Because in some cases, you can say nobody can reply. So you just put your message out and that's the end of it. In some cases, you want to have a conversation with a specific set of people. So for businesses, politicians, public figures, branding, public relations, I thought it was interesting. We need to hear what you folks think about it.
Yes, one, we need to put the Desmond Elliot case in context. Yesterday, at the Lagos State House of Assembly, there was a plenary session on the Lekki toll gate incident. And from the speaker to other members at that plenary session, a number of comments were made. And it looks like the Lagos State House of Assembly suffered a meltdown yesterday in terms of the contributions made by members of that House of Assembly. Starting with the speaker, Obasa, who said the clerk should ask for a minute silence to be observed in memory of patriotic Nigerians who died during the process, and not miscreants who were killed by the police. Now, that caused a lot of problems, among the members of the public. They were saying, those miscreants who were killed by the police, are you justifying police brutality? And then another person spoke, one lady representing Amuwo Dofin CDA Constituency 1, Mojisola Macaulay, I think her name is. And she said, those youths, most of them were drug addicts.
Drugs, right.
That these persons were on drug. And she said a number of other things. Then came the turn of Desmond Elliot, who said culture is gone, called the youths children, attacked celebrities, attacked persons he called social media influencers, even threatened that if social media was not regulated, Nigeria could disappear in the next 6 years. Now that caused an uproar. The social media influencers came after him. The youths came after him. They abused him. They dragged him on every possible platform. They even invaded his privacy and gave reports that, I don't want to repeat, indecent television company.
Dr. Abati.
Maybe one-on-one.
Erection.
Rufai, off your mic.
Erection industry.
So Desmond Elliot was under very serious pressure. And it was like it was not going to stop. So you can understand where he's coming from, why he had to block people from further attacking him on his Twitter account. Now, as a feature introduced by Twitter, I think it's just a way of empowering the owner of the account. Because if you have a Twitter account, an open-ended thing opens you up to a lot of abuse by all kinds of persons whose interest in the comment you have made or access to you is just determined that all of you are in an open-ended space. And these are persons who are anonymous, you do not know them, and these so-called trolls, they can cause people a lot of heartache. And it's like some of them do it deliberately. So as a feature, that gives an individual the opportunity to control his narrative, I think, or the response, or the persons he interacts with, because that platform is interactive. You can choose not to interact with an anonymous audience whose motives you do not know and who may not have any respect for you. Persons who ordinarily cannot even, stay with you physically to interact with you because you don't know them. So as a feature, I think it's okay. But Twitter has also introduced, as you know, a number of other features, to protect the integrity of their space. People can be deplatformed, people can be shadow banned, people can be removed from Twitter. Tweets can be flagged, as they have done so many times to President Donald Trump, whose main office is Twitter, where he engages with Americans and the rest of the world.
Right.
So that I think we should understand where he's coming from. But he said culture is gone. But the big problem that I think Desmond Elliot triggered himself is referring to the youth as children. In our culture, every young person is a child. You move from the opinion, you now talk condescendingly. And that annoyed a lot of people who said, who are you calling children? And you say culture is gone. And yet you are hiding under culture to abuse and talk condescendingly to other people.
I mean, I think it's a conversation that has been on for a while, and I want you to take notice and look at what is currently going on now in the Senate Committee in America and all these top tech companies and what Twitter has been doing over the years. They've been able to establish the fact that the owners of the company and the tech platform have the responsibility to regulate the platform. It's not going to go away. You're going to have trolls. I have been trolled before. A lot of other people have been trolled before. So they have to safeguard. That's why at first Twitter started with having a reporting button where you can report a case of what is happening to you. If people are trolling you, then Twitter will take action.
Right. So
now Twitter has put
if you have a button look from a PR perspective for a business, if you have a button that can report people who are trolling you, then why should you have the feature to not allow them to respond to you for a public relations notice or something that's put out?
The truth is, verbal assault really hurts. I mean, virtual assaults, I should use the word, really, really hurts. And you need to be able to regulate. If possible, from that message, you can put in an email address where people can send valid claims and concerns. But when you're in the midst of a troll, I have been trolled many times for the work I do here. It's not a good one. They say all sorts to you.
Right.
Things that are not true, that are not founded. And because, the sad part of it, Rotus, is when people check your thread and they see the trolls, it's easy for them to believe that you really represent what the trolls are saying about you.
But isn't that free speech?
So we need to be very careful, all right?
Gotcha.
Thank you so much. I really
appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Moving on, for more business update, Michael Wilson, Joseph from London. Hello, Michael. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to take you to China first. The meeting of the plenum, which is their big kind of bigwig powwow, if you like, got together. It was very weak on detail. There may be more written down at the turn of the year, but generally what they're talking about there is that there were no policy bombshells. They were talking, I think, about engendering some kind of domestic resilience, which is actually very, very important as far as China's concerned, simply because, yes, it's good on exports, but it really needs to get its consumption going. And Asia, generally speaking, has looked completely beyond what happened on Wall Street last night. I'll come back to it. And it's entirely likely that equities may give back some of those gains. Again, I'll come back onto that later on. We get big numbers from China over the weekend. We get their manufacturing PMIs. We get South Korea's balance of trade. Tokyo has already said that they're continuing in deflation, so no big change there. The bottom line is right now, the closer you are to China, the better you do, basically. That's it. Now, as far as yesterday is concerned, the US economy appearing to bounce back very strongly. That 33.1% growth in Q3 GDP was taken as being quite good for the economy, as was the slight dip once again in unemployment, but only a very, very slight one. I would point out that yes, it was a great 33.1% increase in GDP for quarter three rather. But if you look at quarter two, a decrease of 31.4%. You don't have to be a mathematician to work out. So they've just come back from a very big dip. And generally, people I was speaking to yesterday were saying that the US economy is not really going to bound back to pre-pandemic levels much beyond the middle of next year. And continuing claims down to 7.75 million. So they still have a problem. There's no question about it. But they were slightly improving figures there. So it was the FANGs yesterday, the Alphabets, the Amazons, the Apples, the Facebook and Google and so on. They all exceeded lots of expectations. Just in the detail of it, Amazon actually doing very well on the back of e-commerce. Facebook, 2.5 billion daily users on Facebook. That's quite incredible, isn't it? But its growth has actually slowed. It's only 3%. It was much more than that earlier in the year, but it only grew 3% over the particular quarter it was working on. And Alphabet, now this is quite an interesting one. Alphabet owns Google and YouTube. And what they're saying is that their results are better because advertising revenues are better. Now, in the old school, and again, we go into a new world, we're not really sure where we're going, but in the old school, you'd look at advertising as being a sort of forward indicator of things not being too bad. So maybe that's something there. European Central Bank coming back across the Atlantic, they didn't announce any change in interest rates yesterday, didn't expect them to. I think the overall message in the way that, why they have these large press conferences, I have no idea. They might as well just say, do you know what? What we're going to do is we're going to wait until December and have a look back. Very wise too, given what's happened with the lockdowns in Spain, Italy, Greece, Germany, and most importantly, France, which has gone into almost total lockdown. What effect that will have on the economy, we only wait to see, basically. I suspect it'll probably be quite nasty. Commodities, oil coming off a bit because of the COVID-19 worries, naturally, and consumption. So precious metals, now, they're looking, this is quite an interesting one as well. Precious metals are kind of looking slightly risk averse. I think more people are going to be turning to this, but they're letting things go over the weekend. And clearly next week is dominated completely by the US election. Are you looking for a smooth result? I mean, I'm not particularly. I suspect it'll, given that 50 million Americans have already voted postally, and we know what the swing states are, it'll be a fascinating evening to watch. But I think risk remains very much in people's minds right now, and you won't see a lot of movement. And my word from the markets this morning is, sure, if you see some kind of equity gains, then sell them. So the market is, tilted towards sellers right now. And I think that'll continue right into the early part of next week, if not beyond Tuesday, November the 3rd. That's my global view.
Well, Michael, how bad is the situation with oil? Global oil prices seem to have been falling, although overnight there was some 1% improvement. But for countries like Nigeria that is oil dependent, oil price, Brent crude is about $38.46 now. And our budget for 2021 is pegged at $40 per barrel. How bad is the situation now that there is oversupply and declining demand with the upsurge in coronavirus cases in Europe and elsewhere? Is it still feasible, the plan by OPEC Plus, to ensure 2 million barrels increase per day by January 2021? Would that happen, or OPEC Plus is better off just waiting and watching?
Right, so there's OPEC, as you quite rightly say, and OPEC Plus. The weakness of the cartel, the OPEC one, the original, the actual big cartel, is that it doesn't act for its own constituent parts. It acts for its major members. So therefore, there will be countries like Nigeria, for example, who will be saying, but we'd like to increase production because we can see the price going down and we need it because we're dependent upon oil for our revenue. So you understand that. Russia too, as well. That's the weakness in all this. But looking outside the market, there are two things. First of all, I don't think that we've reached peak peak oil yet. And it's very, very important to look at the market of carbon capture before you actually worry about whether oil is going to go. Like any other fossil fuels, I feel that carbon scrubbing and carbon capture are going to be big markets coming up. People are not going to immediately switch from using oil to using renewables. It simply won't happen, because you could not engender a kind of system that would do that, number one. Number two, yes, I think that the oil price will probably continue to decrease towards the end of the year. Why am I saying that? I have no special knowledge of it. I'm just using my brains and thinking, well, is COVID going to get any better? Your president has actually been saying, hasn't he, overnight, that that Nigerian economy would not survive a further lockdown. Well, you know, join the club. Exactly. That's the problem, isn't it? And that's what we're facing. So I think that OPEC is slightly out of this at the moment. I think they're looking at it, but basically demand is slipping off because consumption is slipping off. It's as simple as that. So to answer your question in a very roundabout way, I would imagine the oil price would probably not certainly extend much above $40 a barrel before the end of the year. After that, I don't know.
Right, Michael, I'd like to ask you about the economics of this lockdown. Yesterday in Germany, a far-right group went on the street protesting about how the lockdown would terribly damage the German economy. We all know Germany with its big current account surplus and the likes, but everybody seems to be taking a beating in the whole of Europe. What is the economic thinking behind this lockdown?
I think it's a question of, as far as the far right's concerned, I think political parties tend to take advantage of weakness, don't they? And it doesn't matter which party it is. They'll look at it and try to work out how it fits into their own political rhetoric. As far as the economy's concerned, it's what's happening in Germany is sad in a sense, because they had been dealing on their front line very, very well with the pandemic. And now Angela Merkel was saying yesterday and the day before, wasn't she, that frontline health services there are being overwhelmed. And that's the danger. Germany is a very, very ordered society. And if they can't cope with it, I worry about France, although having been there quite recently, I have to say they were dealing with it quite well. How they'll deal with a total lockdown, I have no idea. We're approaching a sort of lockdown, and I suspect that the political parties will, much as they can do, blame the incumbents for what's going on. If you really want the truth of it, it's neither of those things. It's just nobody knows. The scientists, who I keep saying have very little skin in the game because they're employed by the government to do the kind of job that they do, employed by universities. They're not private businesses. They're not small businesses struggling to survive and wondering which way they're going to go. So I think that, you know, fringe parties, scientists and people who have actually, you know, no skin in it will make as much fuss as possible. The scientists must not be proved wrong. That's the danger. We're all journalists. Have you ever come across somebody who molds what they think in this kind of jargon, just like scientists do? It takes a very brave person to cut through that kind of rhetoric and say, come on, what are you actually simply saying? That's what we want, and we haven't got that yet.
All right, thank you so much for that, Michael. Speaking about rhetoric, any rhetoric on the vaccines, Adesua?
Good morning, Rufai. Good morning, Dr. Batan. Good morning, Tundun. Unfortunately, we have recorded over 45 million cases of the coronavirus globally. And the third time in a week, the world has recorded over 500,000 cases. The first time this happened was on the 23rd of October. At that time, it was a record on its own with 506,713 cases. Now, in the week since then, we have globally reported more than 500,000 cases in 24 hours, 2 more times, on the 26th of October and yesterday. If we look at the global figures, we can get them there and the map to show you just how we are progressing with these numbers. Unfortunately, yesterday, the world recorded 524,554 cases. There you have it. We also recorded 6,996 deaths. Look at that graph. You can tell for yourself. I mean, pictures say it all. It is growing. And the staggering infection totals come as the US and Europe also break daily records. Now, talking about those daily records in Europe, we can go to Europe. Hospitals across the continent are filling up at an alarming pace as the continent surpassed the 10 million cases overall, and that's just under a quarter of the global total cases. Now, in Belgium, all non-essential hospital work has been postponed to deal with an influx of new COVID-19 cases. Asymptomatic doctors are to remain at work. In Croatia, they have asked former doctors to come out of retirement to help, while the National Guard troops have flown out from the US to the Czech Republic to assist overwhelmed healthcare professionals there. In Netherlands, new coronavirus patients have had to be transferred by helicopter to Germany to relieve Dutch intensive care units. Now, yesterday, the head of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced that the EU will finance the transfer of patients across borders within the bloc to prevent hospitals from getting overwhelmed. That's how serious the case is in Europe now, emerging as the hardest hit continent once again. Away from Europe, the US recorded its highest daily toll again since the pandemic started. I told you yesterday was just about record-breaking. Now, the U.S. recorded over 90,000 cases yesterday. It's also crossed the threshold of the 9 million cases. You see that graph it's like a yo-yo. It's up and down. It tells you just how the U.S. has been performing. They get it right, and then somehow they don't get it right, but there it is. And President Donald Trump, in the closing days of his campaign, has been assuring voters that the virus is vanishing. But looking at the data, I'm not so sure there are many hopeful signs as to the virus vanishing just yet. Reports of new cases increasing in 42 states. Northeastern states, including New Jersey, Rhode Island, are seeing infection numbers rise after months of stability. In North Dakota, there you see it's more than 5% of the population in North Dakota alone have now tested positive, and that's the biggest share from any state in the United States. But it must also be said that daily reports of deaths in U.S. From the virus remain far below their spring peaks, averaging 780 a day, but those two seem to be rising in some states. And finally, away from the U.S., let's go from the U.S. In Taiwan. As much as the rest of the world is battling a surge, Taiwan just marked its 200th consecutive day without a locally transmitted case of coronavirus. That's good news. Now, Taipei's response to the coronavirus pandemic has been one of the world's most effective. The island of 23 million people last reported a locally transmitted case on the 12th of April. That was Easter Sunday. And as of Thursday, it had confirmed 553 cases. 55 of those were locally transmitted, and 7 deaths so far in the country. What did Taiwan do differently? They didn't have strict lockdowns. They did not resort to drastic restrictions or freedoms like mainland China, which is very close. Instead, Taiwan's response was on speed. Authorities there began screening passengers on direct flights from Wuhan, where it all began, even before the World Health Organization declared this as a global pandemic. Before anyone took it seriously, Taiwan was already working. Let's touch home, guys. Yesterday, Michael Wilson touched on this. Yesterday, President Muhammadu Buhari expressed concern. He says he's watching what is going on around the globe. He's wary of coronavirus surge in other parts, and he's urging Nigerians to ensure that they take all protocols seriously. He says the Nigerian economy cannot simply afford a second wave of the coronavirus. The president, who has oftentimes addressed the country through his task force since the pandemic began, made this known in a tweet. If you can get that tweet right up. His official Twitter handle yesterday, the president made this known. Okay, perhaps we can get that tweet up. But this must be said that the president's concern comes on the same day the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Africa CDC, warned that the continent must brace up for a second wave of the coronavirus cases, as some 6 to 9 countries have seen their cases creeping up in the last 1 month. So President Muhammadu Buhari is watching what's happening in the world, is saying Nigerians must take precautions, that the economy cannot afford a coronavirus second wave.
I have to congratulate Taiwan on their achievement. It's really quite remarkable. They only had 500 cases and 7 deaths. Extraordinary. Their population is 23 million people. But I do wish that the WHO had studied the Taiwanese model of test, trace, quarantine, rather than bow to pressure from China and try to exclude Taiwan, because as we can see, they have had the most sterling record in the world. It's unfortunate.
Well,
Indeed.
quickly, I hope that countries like Nigeria and other African countries can learn from the example of Taiwan. I don't want to talk about leadership being a major issue in this regard, considering the fact that the COVID-19 response in Taiwan is led by former vice president, who is a scientist,
Infectious disease experts.
an epidemiologist,
Yes.
in fact, former vice president Chen Qian. Now, here in Nigeria, yes, our president is right when he says our economy cannot take that bashing. I mean, inflation is about 16.71% as at the end of September. The Nigerian GDP contracted by 6.1%. Over 27% are unemployed. Now, Nigeria has been very greatly adversely affected by COVID-19 during the lockdown of 5 months. If we lock down again, with the combined effect of the anti-SARS protests, then of course the economy will be completely on its knees, and the implication for social stability and peace would be quite dire indeed. But the thing is for government to continue to focus on the key issues in terms of mobilizing people to follow the guidelines.
Right. Thank you so much, Adeswai.